When morning came, the prairie was quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean. Puddles shimmered in the pale light, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. The sky, once dark with fury, now glowed soft pink and gold as the first sunbeams crept over the horizon. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers. Smoke curled lazily from the hearth, but the warmth barely reached the small bed in the corner where Mary Collins lay still. Luke sat beside her, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the face that no longer moved. He had known the moment her breathing changed, how it had gone shallow, then quiet, then stopped altogether. He had felt her fingers slacken in his palm, and then there had been only silence. Now, hours later, he still couldn't bring himself to move. The room seemed smaller somehow, heavier, filled with the hush that follows loss. Emma stirred in the wooden chair by the wall. She blinked against the morning light, her hair tangled, her small face streaked with tears she hadn't remembered crying. "Mr. Carson?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Luke turned slowly toward her, his expression soft but solemn. He didn't need to say anything. Children know. They can feel the truth before it's spoken. Emma's gaze went to her mother, then back to him. "She's gone, isn't she?" He nodded once. "Yes, sweetheart. She's gone." The words hung in the air like smoke. Emma's lower lip trembled, and she clutched the blanket around her shoulders. For a long moment, she didn't move, as though the world might right itself if she stayed perfectly still. Then she whispered, "I told her I'd get better at drawing water. I told her next summer I'd do it faster so she wouldn't worry." Her voice cracked on the last word. Luke rose and crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair. He took her hand gently. "You kept her alive longer than any doctor could have, Emma. You gave her a reason to hold on." She looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "What do we do now?" Luke exhaled slowly. He glanced toward the window, where the light was growing stronger. "We'll lay her to rest proper," he said quietly. "She deserves peace." Together they prepared the burial. Luke built a simple pine box from old boards behind the cabin. His hands worked steadily, though his throat felt tight with every nail he drove. Emma helped where she could, folding her mother's shawl, brushing her hair one last time, and placing a small wildflower between her fingers. By mid-morning, the storm clouds had drifted away, leaving a clear, endless blue sky. Luke carried the coffin out to a spot beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the field, the only place on that barren land where grass still grew green. Emma followed silently, holding a bunch of daisies she'd picked after the rain. They said no fancy words, no sermon. Luke spoke simply, his voice steady but low. Mary Collins was a good woman. She worked hard, loved hard, and never gave up, not even when the world turned cruel. She raised a daughter stronger than most men I've known. Emma knelt beside the grave and placed her flowers on the mound of fresh earth. "I'll be good, Mama," she whispered. "I promise." Luke put a hand on her shoulder. "You already are, little one." They stood there for a long while, listening to the wind move through the branches, the leaves whispering softly as if carrying Mary's spirit away across the plains. When at last they turned back toward the cabin, Luke lifted Emma into the saddle in front of him. She leaned against his chest, clutching his coat. As they rode into town, the prairie stretched wide and golden before them. Somewhere behind, under the oak, a single beam of sunlight touched the fresh grave like a blessing. Luke looked down at the girl in his arms, small, quiet, brave, and said, "You're not alone, Emma, not ever again." And though she didn't answer, her tiny hand found his and held on tight. The sun rose slow and golden over the prairie, spilling light across the drenched earth. The storm had left everything washed clean. The grasses glistened, the air smelled sweet and alive, and tiny wildflowers had sprung up overnight where the rain had fallen hardest. It was the kind of morning that felt like a promise, quiet and full of something new. Luke Carson stood outside the cabin, his hat in his hands, looking out toward the oak tree at the far edge of the field. The fresh mound of earth beneath its wide branches was still dark with rain, a single bunch of daisies resting on top. The breeze carried the faintest creak of the tree limbs, almost like a whisper. He nodded toward it once, a silent farewell, then turned back to the cabin. Inside, the little girl was packing her few belongings into a small burlap sack, her mother's shawl, a wooden comb, and a Bible with its pages worn soft from use. "You ready, Emma?" he asked gently from the doorway. She looked up at him, her eyes swollen from crying but steady now, older somehow. "Yes, sir," she said, pulling the shawl tight around her shoulders. "Mama always said we should go where there's light." Luke smiled faintly. "Smart woman, your mama." He helped her climb onto his horse, his old roan gelding dusty. The animal nickered softly as if sensing the change in the air. Luke swung up behind her, steadying her small frame in front of him. They started down the narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The land shimmered beneath the early sun, endless and open, stretching far beyond what either of them could see. Birds darted low over the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a creek ran full again for the first time in months. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind were enough. Then Emma leaned back slightly against him and asked, "Where will we go now?" Luke thought for a moment before answering. "There's a small town south of here called Clearwater. Got good folks, a school, a doctor. Maybe we start there. Maybe find a place that feels like home." Emma was quiet for a bit, then said softly, "Can I call you Pa?" The question caught him off guard. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "If you want to," he said, his voice low. "I do." He smiled, a real smile this time, the kind he hadn't felt in years. "Then I reckon I'd be proud to have you do that." They rode on. As the sun climbed higher, Luke pointed out a herd of antelope running along the ridge, their sleek bodies gleaming in the light. Emma gasped with wonder, her small hand clutching his sleeve. For the first time since the storm, she laughed, a bright, free sound that carried across the plains. "See that?" Luke said, his voice warm. "That's what your mama wanted for you, to be out here free and strong, not afraid of the world." Emma nodded, her braid swinging as she looked ahead. "She said I'd be brave if I had someone to show me how." Luke's eyes softened. "Guess we'll have to teach each other then." They reached the crest of a hill and Luke reined the horse to a stop. From there, the prairie rolled out before them, green and endless, dotted with wildflowers and promise. The morning sun burned bright on the horizon, painting the world in gold. Emma lifted her face toward it, closing her eyes for a moment. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Luke looked down at her, then at the road stretching ahead. "It is," he agreed quietly. "And it's all ours now." He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward again, steady and sure. Together they rode into the light, two souls bound not by blood, but by something stronger, the kind of love born from loss, shaped by kindness, and carried on the wind of new beginnings. Behind them, the cabin and the oak tree faded from view, but neither looked back. The storm had passed. The day was young, and for the first time in a long, long while, neither of them was alone. The next few days passed quietly, marked by the sound of hammering, the scent of boiling broth, and the faint laughter of a child who hadn't laughed in a long time. Luke Carson kept his word. He rode into town the morning after meeting Mary and Emma, returning with a small cart full of supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and a tin of medicine for fever. The townsfolk had stared when he'd asked for those things, whispering about the stranger who'd gone out to the Collins place. Most folks avoided that road, claiming it was cursed with bad luck. But Luke wasn't the kind of man who cared about gossip. When he returned, Emma was waiting by the fence, her small hands gripping the weathered wood. The moment she saw him, her face brightened, though she tried to hide it behind her usual pride. "You came back," she said, pretending surprise. "Told you I would," Luke replied, lifting a sack of flour from his saddle. "I keep my promises." She hesitated before offering a shy smile. "Mama says most men don't." Luke's expression softened. "Your mama sounds like a woman who's had to learn too much the hard way." Inside, Mary was resting, her skin still pale but her breathing easier. When she opened her eyes and saw the sacks of food, She tried to rise from her bed in protest. "Mr. Carson, I told you?" Luke raised a hand gently. "You didn't ask, ma'am. I did. Let me help." There was a quiet dignity in his tone that left no room for argument. Mary leaned back, exhausted but grateful. That afternoon, he set to work mending the roof. Emma followed him everywhere, carrying nails in her apron pocket, fetching boards and asking endless questions. "Were you really a cowboy?" she asked, watching as he climbed the ladder. "Still am, last I checked," Luke said with a grin. "Do you shoot bad men?" "Only when they make it necessary." She squinted up at him. "You don't look like the kind of man who shoots people." He laughed softly. "Let's hope I never have to prove you wrong." As the sun dipped low, they worked side by side, patching holes, stacking firewood, and sweeping the dust from the porch. It wasn't much, but the cabin began to feel like a home again. That evening, when the stars came out, Luke cooked a pot of stew over the fire. The smell filled the room, rich and comforting. Mary ate a few spoonfuls, the most she'd managed in days, and Emma devoured hers like she hadn't seen food in weeks. When the dishes were done and the fire burned low, Luke stepped outside. The prairie stretched endlessly before him, silent except for the distant call of a coyote. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke twist into the dark. Behind him, the door creaked open. Emma stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Mama says thank you," she murmured. Luke nodded. "Tell her she don't owe me thanks." She hesitated. "Are you going to leave when the roof's fixed?" He looked at her for a long moment. The moonlight caught her face. So small, yet carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much for her age. "No," he said finally. "Not while your mama needs me." A silence settled between them, deep and gentle. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, and somewhere far off thunder rumbled. Emma looked out at the horizon. "Do you think it'll rain soon?" "Maybe," Luke said. "Everything changes sooner or later." She nodded thoughtfully, then turned to go inside. Before she did, she said, "Mama says God sends people when we need them most." "Maybe he sent you." Luke watched her go, his throat tight. When the door closed, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "Maybe he did." Then he made himself a promise, quiet, steady, carved in the dust and the dark. He would not ride away from these two souls until they had a chance to live again. And for the first time in years, Luke Carson felt the stir of something he thought he'd buried long ago. Hope. The sky turned. Strange the day the storm came, it began. As a soft hum in the distance, a low grumble of thunder rolling across the prairie like an old beast stirring from its sleep. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and rain that had not yet fallen. Luke looked up from chopping firewood and frowned at the horizon. Clouds were gathering, dark, swollen, and angry. He wiped his brow and called out toward the cabin. "Emma, best bring them clothes off the line." The little girl appeared in the doorway, her braid whipping in the wind. "Is it raining, Mr. Carson?" "Not yet," he said, glancing west. "But it will. And soon." She hurried out, barefoot and quick, yanking the half-dry clothes from the rope and clutching them to her chest. The wind picked up, swirling around her like a living thing. Luke took the bundle from her arms and rushed inside. By the time he shut the door, the first drops began to fall, big, fat splashes that hit the roof like hammer blows. Within minutes, the rain came in sheets, drumming so hard it drowned out everything else. Mary stirred in her bed, eyes half open. "It's raining?" she whispered, her voice thin but full of wonder. Luke nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Looks like the sky finally remembered us." A smile ghosted over her face. "Thank the Lord. I thought the earth forgot how." He smiled back, but the warmth in his chest quickly faded. Her skin looked paler than ever, her breath shallow. The medicine he'd brought had helped for a while, but her strength was slipping again. Fever spots burned along her cheeks, and her hands trembled when she reached for the cup beside her bed. Emma hurried to her mother's side. "Mama, you need to drink more." Mary tried, but the effort made her cough, a dry, painful sound that shook her thin frame. Luke knelt beside her, steadying the cup. "Easy now," he said softly. Small sips. The fire crackled, shadows dancing against the walls. Outside, the storm raged louder, rattling the shutters and shaking the roof Luke had repaired days before. The wind howled through the cracks, and a streak of lightning lit the room white for an instant, followed by a crash that made Emma jump. Luke put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. Just thunder. Won't hurt us none." But the girl's eyes darted to her mother's face, pale and sweating. "She's getting worse," Emma whispered. Luke knew she was right. The fever had returned in force. He touched Mary's forehead. It was burning hot. "We'll ride for Doc Harper soon as this storm lets up," he promised. Mary opened her eyes weakly, her voice trembling. "Luke, don't waste a ride on me. You'll drown out there." He shook his head. "You hush now. I've rode through worse for less reason." She gave a faint smile, but her eyes were distant. "Promise me something," she said after a long pause. "Anything," he replied. If I don't make it, promise you'll look after my Emma. She's strong, but she's still just a little girl." Luke's jaw tightened. "Don't talk like that. You're gonna pull through." Mary's hand found his. "Please." He looked into her eyes, soft, pleading, filled with all the love a mother could hold. And in that moment he saw Henry Collins again, his old friend's face flashing through memory, the same stubborn courage. "I promise," Luke said quietly, "she won't ever be alone." Mary's breath came easier, as though that vow had lifted some weight from her chest. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Thank you." Hours passed. The storm howled on, and Luke sat beside her, changing the damp cloth on her forehead, while Emma dozed in a chair, exhaustion overtaking fear. Near midnight, the wind began to ease. The thunder rolled farther away, and the rain softened to a steady patter. But Mary's fever did not break. Luke stayed awake, listening to her breathing grow shallower with each passing hour. He held her hand until dawn touched the windows and the storm finally passed. Outside, the earth drank deeply for the first time in months. But inside that small cabin, the air grew still again, and a different kind of silence took hold. The next morning, the wind blew in from the east, dry and sharp as broken glass. Emma woke before dawn, the way she always did, her small frame curled beside the dying embers of last night's fire. The cabin was cold and still. Only her mother's shallow breathing filled the silence. Mary Collins hadn't eaten much in days. Her fever burned on and off, and her voice had grown faint, sometimes so faint that Emma had to lean close to hear her. "Mama," she whispered, touching her mother's forehead. It was warm, too warm. The rag she'd left there was dry again. Mary's eyes fluttered open. "Emmy, water?" "Yes, Mama, I'll fetch it now." Emma pulled on her boots, their soles nearly split, and stepped outside. The sky was gray, bruised with heat and dust. The well seemed farther every day, though she'd walked that road so often she could do it with her eyes closed. Her hands ached, her shoulders sore, but she kept walking. When she reached the well, she stopped short. The cowboy was there. Luke Carson stood by his horse, hat in hand, as though he'd been waiting. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried concern. "Morning, Emma," she hesitated. "You're here again." "Didn't figure you'd mind," he said softly. "You looked awful tired yesterday," Emma frowned. "You don't need to help me." He nodded toward the buckets. "I know. But I'm gonna anyway." She wanted to argue, but the truth was she was too tired. Together they drew the water in silence. His movements were careful and practiced, and when he handed her the filled bucket, she realized her arms didn't ache as much. As they started back, Luke's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "That your place over the ridge?" Emma nodded. "It's just me and Mama now." He didn't answer right away. The words hung between them, heavy and sad. Finally, he said quietly, "Your pa, he gone long?" 2 years, Emma replied, keeping her eyes on the path. "Said he'd find work." "Never wrote." Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When they reached the cabin, Emma stopped at the gate. "You can leave the buckets there." "Thank you, mister." Luke hesitated. "Maybe I could say hello to your mama." Just to be polite. Emma's first instinct was to refuse, but politeness was something her mother had always insisted on, even when there was nothing left to offer. So she nodded reluctantly. All right, but she's sick. Don't stay long. Luke followed her inside, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the smell of illness and dust hit him. The small room was bare, save for a narrow bed, a rickety table, and 2 chipped cups. The walls were cracked from years of weather. A single quilt hung over the window to block the sun. Mary Collins turned her head slowly as they entered. Her eyes, though fevered, still held a spark of grace. "Ma'am," Luke said gently, removing his hat. "Name's Luke Carson." "I found your girl at the well and thought I'd lend a hand." Mary tried to smile. "You're kind, Mr. Carson. Not many ride this far out." Luke stepped closer, studying her face, and then froze. There was something familiar in her features. The curve of her cheek, the way she said his name, it struck him with the force of memory. "Mary." "Collins, you said?" he asked quietly. She nodded faintly. "Yes," Luke's breath caught. "I used to ride with a man named Henry Collins. Long time ago. Worked cattle down near Ailing." "You wouldn't happen to be his sister, would you?" Mary's tired eyes widened. "Henry, my brother?" Her lips trembled. "He used to write me, before the letters stopped." Luke sank onto the nearest chair, disbelief washing over him. "Well, I'll be. He saved my hide once. Never forgot him." He glanced toward Emma, who was watching silently. "And this must be your niece." Emma blinked, confused. "You knew Uncle Henry?" Luke smiled softly. "I surely did." Then more serious. "He'd want me to help you both, ma'am." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Help?" she whispered. "Mr. Carson, there's little to help with but kindness, and that's more than we've seen in years." Luke looked around the room, the sagging roof, the empty shelves, the worn little girl standing too straight, for her age, and felt something shift deep inside him. He wasn't about to ride away and leave them to fade, quietly in the dust, not when fate had brought him here. A long moment after the truth fell between them, the cabin was silent except for the soft rattle of the wind through the cracks in the wall. Luke Carson sat very still on the old wooden chair, his hat in his hands, turning the brim between his fingers. Across from him, Mary Collins tried to sit up, but the effort left her trembling. "You knew my brother," she whispered, as if afraid to believe it. Luke nodded slowly. "Sure did. Henry Collins was one of the best men I ever rode with. We drove cattle together back in '69 before the big blizzard hit. He talked about his sister all the time, said she had a laugh that could make a hard day feel short." Mary let out a shaky breath. That was a lifetime ago. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where Emma stood, wide-eyed and silent, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. She'd never met her Uncle Henry, only heard his name in stories her mother told when she was strong enough to talk. Luke cleared his throat. "He saved my life once. A steer came at me horns first. Henry tackled me clean out of the way. Broke his arm doing it and still finished the drive. Toughest man I ever knew." He gave a faint smile. "I lost track of him after the war. Always meant to write, but life has a way of taking folks different directions." Mary's eyes glistened. "He wrote for a while. Then the letters stopped. I prayed he'd made it somewhere safe." "He did?" Luke said softly. "He married, settled near Dodge City. Had a boy, I think." He hesitated, then added, "He passed some years back. Fever took him. I was there when he went." The words hung heavy in the air. Mary pressed a trembling hand to her lips, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emma moved closer, clutching her mother's sleeve. "I'm sorry," Luke murmured. "If I'd known you were his kin, I'd have come sooner." Mary shook her head. "Don't you apologize for the world turning cruel. Mr. Carson, none of us can stop it." He looked around the little cabin again. The cracked ceiling, the empty shelves, the pile of firewood that wouldn't last a week, and felt a deep ache in his chest. This woman, his old friend's sister, had been left to fight sickness and hunger alone, with only a child for help. "How long you been like this?" he asked quietly. Mary gave a weak shrug. "Since my husband went looking for work 2 winters ago. He never came back. Might have found another life, or none at all." Luke's jaw tightened. "And no one from town's helped?" "Pride's a hard thing to swallow," she said with a sad smile. "And folks round here don't like to meddle in another's misfortune." Emma looked up at Luke, her eyes fierce for such a small face. "We don't need charity, mister. I take care of Mama." Luke met her gaze and nodded solemnly. "I can see that. You're doing a fine job, too. But everyone needs a hand now and then, Emma. Even your mama's brother asked for mine once." That made her pause. Her defiance softened, curiosity flickering in her eyes. He turned back to Mary. "You mind if I stay a few days? Help mend the roof, fetch more water, maybe bring some medicine from town?" Mary's lips parted as if to protest, but she saw the earnestness in his eyes, the same quiet strength she remembered in Henry's. "If you're sure," she said finally, voice trembling. "I don't have anything to give you." Luke stood, setting his hat back on his head. "You already gave me more than you know, ma'am. A piece of my past I thought was gone for good." Mary smiled weakly, closing her eyes as if the burden on her heart had lightened just a little. Emma followed Luke to the door, still wary but not unkind. "You really knew Uncle Henry?" she asked. Luke nodded. "I sure did. He'd be proud of you." The girl blinked, her throat tight. "You think so?" "I know so." He looked out at the endless plain, the sky turning gold with evening light. "And I reckon he'd want me to make sure you and your mama are looked after." As the wind swept across the prairie, carrying the smell of dust and wild sage, Luke Carson made himself a quiet promise. He would not ride away from this place until the Collins women were safe. And for the first time in a long while, the empty cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The morning began like every other. The same cruel heat, the same quiet desperation. Emma trudged the path to the well, her feet tracing the same cracked earth she'd walked for months. The sun had barely risen, yet the air already burned. She carried her empty buckets, the handles cutting into her palms. The world around her was so still that even her footsteps sounded too loud. But that morning was different, because she wasn't alone. When she reached the well, she noticed something strange, fresh hoofprints in the dust. They were deep, round, and new. Her heart fluttered, part fear, part curiosity. Nobody came this far out. The nearest ranch was miles away. She lowered the bucket, listening to the creak of the rope. The sound echoed in the open air. Somewhere behind her, a horse snorted. Emma froze. Her fingers tightened around the rope. "Easy there," came a man's voice, low, calm, carrying a warmth she hadn't heard in months. Emma turned slowly. A rider sat a few yards away, atop a chestnut horse with a white blaze down its nose. The man wore a dusty hat, a worn coat, and a revolver on his belt. His face was shadowed by the brim, but his eyes, steady and kind, met hers. He wasn't young, but not old either. The sort of man who'd seen enough to make his gaze heavy but not cruel. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the grass. Then he tipped his hat slightly. "Morning, miss." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Morning." He looked around, his voice careful. "Ain't safe for a young one to be out here alone." "You live nearby?" Her mother's warning echoed in her head. "Don't talk to strangers, Emma. Not ever." So she straightened her back, just as her mother used to when she wanted to seem strong, and said, "I'm fine, sir. I can fetch the water myself." The cowboy nodded, not pushing. "Didn't say you couldn't." He dismounted, his movements slow, respectful. The leather of his saddle creaked softly as he tied his horse to a fence post near the well. "Just thought I'd water my mare while you finish up." "She's been traveling a ways." Emma glanced at the horse. A fine creature, sweat-darkened and tired, yet gentle-eyed. The girl hesitated, then gave a small nod. "The water's deep but clean if you wait for the sand to settle." He smiled. "Much obliged." As she worked the rope, drawing the full bucket up from the well, the cowboy watched her. Not in the way that made her nervous, but with something like quiet respect. The bucket wobbled, sloshing water over her hands, and he stepped forward without a word, catching the handle to steady it. "Here," he said softly. "That's heavy work for such small arms." "I can manage," she muttered, though she didn't pull away. "I don't doubt it," he replied. His smile was faint, but genuine. "Still, no harm in a bit of help." Together they lifted the bucket and poured some into his horse's trough. The mare drank greedily, the sound of slurping water loud in the dry air. Emma watched in silence, caught between suspicion and a strange comfort she didn't want to feel. When the horse had finished, the cowboy crouched beside the well, splashed his face, and looked up at her again. "You got a name, little one?" "Emma," she said quietly. Then, with a spark of courage, she added, "What's yours?" He smiled faintly. "Luke. Luke Carson." For a moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers meeting at the edge of nowhere. Then Luke's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where a single wisp of chimney smoke rose against the sky. He nodded toward it. "That's your home, Emma." Her small shoulders stiffened. "My mama's there," she said. Something softened in his face. His next words came gently, but they carried a weight that made her heart tremble. "You out here fetching water for her all by yourself?" Emma hesitated, the truth caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." Luke's brow furrowed. He rose slowly, his hat shadowing his eyes. "Well then," he said quietly, his voice deep as the well behind them. "No one should have to do that alone." And though she didn't know it yet, that moment, the stranger's shadow falling across the well, was the start of everything that would change her life forever. Emma's heart beat faster as the cowboy, Luke Carson, stood beside her. The morning sun was climbing higher, throwing long shadows over the cracked earth. She felt suddenly small, as if the whole world had paused to watch her next move. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Men on the road don't stop for nothing good. Emma, you keep your eyes down and your distance wide." And yet, this man had helped her without asking anything in return. He hadn't reached for his gun. He hadn't asked for food or directions. He had simply offered his hand when the bucket grew too heavy. Still, kindness was a dangerous thing. Emma clutched the handle of her bucket tightly. "I should go," she said. "Mama's waiting," Luke nodded, his face unreadable. "That's fair. I won't keep you." He turned toward his horse, tightening the strap on his saddle. "Need me to ride alongside you? Just to make sure you get home safe?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I've done this plenty." He gave a small smile as if he'd expected that answer. "I can see that. You're tougher than most grown folks I've met." That made something warm flicker in her chest. Pride, maybe. But she hid it behind a scowl. "I don't need help," she muttered. He tipped his hat. "Didn't say you did." Emma started down the path, her small boots stirring up clouds of dust. But after a few steps, she could feel his presence behind her, the soft clop of hooves following at a respectful distance. She wanted to tell him to go away, but the truth was, she didn't want to. The path felt less lonely with someone else on it, even if that someone was a stranger. The bucket swayed with her steps, water sloshing against the rims. Each one weighed nearly as much as she did. Sweat trickled down her neck, stinging her skin. Halfway home, she stumbled, catching herself just before the water spilled. "Careful," Luke called out. "I said I'm fine." She snapped without looking back. He chuckled quietly. "Never said you weren't." His voice wasn't mocking. It was calm, steady, the way her father's used to sound before he left. That only made her angrier. She didn't want reminders of her father. She didn't want pity. When they reached the last hill before her cabin, Emma stopped. The bucket set down with a dull thud. She turned to face him, her chin lifted high. "You can stop now. I don't want my mama seeing a stranger following me." Luke dismounted, keeping his hands visible and gentle. "That's smart of you, Emma. Your mama raised you right." He paused. "I'll wait here then. Just want to make sure you get inside safe." She hesitated. His eyes were steady, kind but not soft. There was something about him, something that didn't fit with the roughness of his clothes or the pistol at his side. She wanted to believe him. Emma nodded once, then lifted the buckets again. Her arms trembled, but she didn't let him see. Step by step, she climbed the hill and disappeared over the ridge toward the cabin. Luke stood by his horse, watching her go. When she reached the door, he saw her pause and glance back. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the dry field. Then she went inside and the door shut behind her. He let out a slow breath. Something about that child, Her stubborn pride, her worn-out courage, lodged in his chest and wouldn't let go. Emma inside set the buckets by the bed. Her mother smiled weakly, unaware of the stranger who waited beyond the hill. "You made it back, my brave girl," Mary whispered. Emma brushed the dust from her hands and nodded. "Yes, Mama, I made it." But even as she spoke, her heart beat differently. She could still hear the echo of hooves on the path and the voice that had said, "No one should have to do that alone." And though she didn't admit it, not even to herself, part of her was hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'd come back tomorrow. The prairie had forgotten the taste of rain. Each morning, the horizon shimmered like molten glass, the sun rising over fields that once swayed green, but now lay brittle and yellow, broken under the weight of drought. The air itself seemed tired, thin, dry, and dusted with the smell of heat. In the midst of it all, a little girl made her way down the narrow, cracked path that led to the old well. Her name was Emma Collins, and though she was only 9, her steps carried the weariness of someone much older. She wore a faded calico dress 2 sizes too big and boots with holes in the toes. A pair of tin buckets swung from her hands, knocking against her knees as she walked. Every few paces she paused to catch her breath, her small frame trembling under the weight of responsibility that no child should bear. The well stood on the edge of what used to be the town's commons, now a patch of dust and forgotten weeds. Most families had left the area when the water started to dry up, heading east in search of wetter ground and better luck. But Emma and her mother had stayed. They didn't have a wagon or a horse, and even if they had, her mother had fallen sick before they could make plans to leave. That morning, the girl's throat was parched. Her lips cracked, but she didn't drink first. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, soft, gentle, but firm. "Always for the kettle first, Emmy girl. We share after." She smiled faintly at the memory, even as she lowered the bucket into the well. The rope creaked, the sound hollow and lonely in the open air. When the bucket finally hit the water below, the splash was small, like a whisper from the deep. She drew it up carefully, her thin arms straining, droplets sparkling as they fell from the rope in the sunlight. When the bucket surfaced, she stared into it for a long moment. The water was murky, with flecks of sand swirling in the bottom. Still, it was water, and that was enough. She poured it carefully into her pail, then repeated the process for the second one. By the time both were full, her back ached, and her palms were raw from the coarse rope. But she didn't complain. She never did. The walk home was harder. The weight of the water pulled at her shoulders, slowing her small steps. She had to stop twice to rest, sitting on a flat stone at the edge of the trail. Around her, the prairie stretched in every direction, miles of emptiness, broken only by the sound of grasshoppers and the far-off cry of a hawk. No one ever came down this path anymore. The old Collins homestead sat alone, a few miles beyond, half hidden by the rise of the land. As she walked, she thought of her mother, lying weak and pale on the bed they'd pushed near the window for light. Emma imagined her waiting, worrying, whispering a prayer that her daughter would return safely. That thought kept the girl moving. Each step became a promise. The sun climbed higher, burning against the back of her neck. Sweat rolled into her eyes. When she finally reached the bend that revealed their little cabin, relief flooded her chest. The place wasn't much, just one room, a crooked chimney, and a patch of dry earth that once grew beans. But to Emma, it was the whole world. She set down the buckets at the door, brushed the dust from her dress, and whispered, "I'm home." "Mama!" From inside came a faint cough, followed by her mother's voice, weak but smiling. "Good girl, Emmy. You're my brave one." And though her arms trembled and her throat ached, Emma smiled back. In the silence of the dry land, her mother's words were the only rain that still fell. The buckets were heavier that morning. Or maybe Emma was just more tired. She pushed open the cabin door with her shoulder, the hinges crying out like an old man's knees. The air inside was thick and still, the kind that held the scent of sickness. The single window let in a blade of sunlight that fell across the narrow bed where her mother lay. Mary Collins stirred, her eyes half open, their once bright blue dimmed to a cloudy gray. "Is it morning already?" she whispered. Emma set the buckets down and hurried to her mother's side. "Yes, Mama, I brought the water. It took a bit longer today. The rope's getting rough." Mary tried to smile. "You always manage, my brave girl." Emma poured a little water into a chipped mug and lifted it to her mother's lips. The woman drank slowly, every swallow a visible effort. Then she sighed, resting back against the flattened pillow. The girl soaked a rag and laid it across her mother's forehead. That small act of care, learned by necessity, had become her daily ritual. Outside, the wind moaned softly through the cracks in the cabin wall. The sound reminded Emma of the river she had never seen but often dreamed of, wide and blue and full of life. She imagined dipping her hands into it, letting the cool current wash away the dirt and fear. But when she looked down at her raw, reddened palms, she remembered there was no river here, only dust. The buckets sat by the door, glinting in the sunlight. They were never enough. She had to make that water last the whole day, for her mother's fever, for the kettle, and for cleaning the few dishes they owned. Sometimes she allowed herself a sip. Other times she went without. Mary noticed the look in her daughter's eyes. "You drink some too, Emmy. Don't you go fainting on me." Emma shook her head. "I'm not thirsty, Mama." It was a lie, but she'd told it so many times it no longer trembled on her lips. She moved quietly around the small room, sweeping the dirt from the floor and straightening the table that wobbled on one leg. Every chore felt heavier now, like she was carrying the whole cabin on her shoulders. Yet she never complained. Complaining took breath, and breath was something she'd learned to save. At midday, she stepped outside to hang the rag in the sun. The land stretched out before her, endless and unforgiving. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sliding across the ground like a ghost. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke, someone, somewhere, burning brush. The world felt both vast and empty, and Emma, standing in its center, felt small enough to disappear. She sat on the stoop and rubbed her aching arms. The wooden bucket handles had cut red grooves into her skin. She thought about her father, the man who had once told her stories about catching wild horses and planting a garden that could feed them through winter. That was before he'd left to find work 2 summers ago. No letters had come, no word. Her mother still believed he'd return. Emma wasn't so sure anymore. The sun beat down harder, and she pulled her knees to her chest, watching heat shimmer over the dry field. Her eyelids drooped. For a moment, she drifted somewhere between waking and dreaming. In her dream, the well was full again, and her mother stood beside her, healthy and laughing. The sound of that laughter wrapped around her like cool water. But when she opened her eyes, the world was still dry, and the buckets by the door reminded her of tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Emma rose, brushed the dust from her dress, and went back inside. Her mother was asleep again, breathing shallowly. The girl touched her hand gently, whispering, "I'll get more water tomorrow, Mama, I promise." Outside, the wind carried her promise across the empty land, and for just a moment it almost sounded like rain.